In this Lords of the Fallen video, I'm going to be showing you my Death Knight build. This is a mid-game build that focuses on using Inferno and Radiance and using a catalyst that casts Umbral magic, as well as does wither damage and physical damage. So let's take a look at the sword we're using for this build. We're using Rosamund's sword. This is a long sword, so it's somewhere between a short sword and a grand sword. Swings kind of in the middle in terms of attack speed, does decent damage. Half of its damage is physical, half of its wither. Has some decent requirements in strength and agility, radiance, and inferno in order to use, and scales with all 4 attributes. It also does frostbite buildup on each swing. Frostbite sort of builds up until it triggers like a damage explosion and also reduces the target's stamina by half. This is particularly good if you're fighting another player, although this is not a PvP-oriented build specifically. But if you happen to get invaded, that's really good against that. Now, some people might be wondering, like, why wither damage? When you look at enemies and you hit them with wither damage, you'll see their bar goes white where you're doing the wither damage, and then you need to connect again in order to rip off that wither health, just like it would happen if it was happening to you. You might think that's extra steps, and in some cases you might be right. But what wither damage is really good at doing is dealing with Umbral enemies. When you're in Umbral, the Umbral realm, and you're fighting the enemies that only appear in the Umbral realm, most of them are weak to wither damage, which are normally resistant to just about every other type of damage. So this is really, really strong when you're fighting in the Umbral realm. Now, the trick about this is that this weapon is not available until, like, probably a good 10 hours or so into the game, so you're going to have to use something else in the meantime. I recommend using any weapon that has high base damage, that doesn't have great scaling, unless it's Inferno or Radiant scaling, just because it's hard to find any other weapon earlier on in the game that scales decently with Inferno and Radiance. So it kind of doesn't matter too much what weapon you use, but the higher the base damage and the lower the scaling, the more damage you're going to get out of it, while you're not really putting points into like strength and agility. Now for our shield, I have the Pale Eye Shield. This one is acquired very early on in the game in Pilgrim's Perch. It has requirements of Radiance and Inferno, which is great because that's what we're focusing on for this build. And I've socketed this with 2 runes. One of these you get in the Sunless Skein that basically give you mana regeneration over time, and the other one gives you health regeneration over time. So you're going to gain back mana, which is great because you're constantly using spells with this build, and you're also going to gain back some health over time. So if you like take a little bit of chip damage here and there, not the end of the world. Now for the catalyst that I'm using for this build, I'm actually using the one that you can buy from Molhu at the beginning, Charm of Fortune Sight. It has decent spell power. It has 4 spell slots. And it's a little ways into the game before you can gain another one of these. So by the time you do get another one, you're probably going to have your, this one upgraded quite a ways. So I don't see a lot of point in switching at that point. 4 slots is a good amount anyway. And for spells, I'm using Umbral Orb. This is kind of your go-to range spell. Every magic type has like a predominant, like cheap range spell. This is Umbral's. And it's really good at like, dealing with pesky ranged enemies that you just can't reach. And it's a nice to have as an option. And then I have Umbral Weapon. This further buffs your weapon with, more damage, particularly wither damage. So when you hit enemies or other players, you're going to be dealing more damage. This is a really good buff. Early on in the game, you might substitute this for Poison Weapon in order to do poison buildup. This is much better on like a boss or something like that than regular enemies, but Umbral Weapon is definitely what you want to use for trash. You might sub this out for Poison Weapon when you're fighting bosses. And then I have Latimer's Javelin. This is an Umbral spell that you get from defeating the Hush Saint and buying it from Molhu from his Remembrance. This is kind of like a ranged spell that does like an AoE on impact. It's really nice for dealing with groups of enemies or doing like high damage to a ranged enemy, just trying to pick them off real quick. Highly recommend this one if you can get it. And then I also really like Umbral Guardian, and what this does is it summons like a giant eye that kind of like follows you around for like 20 or 30 seconds. It just constantly does wither damage to enemies that are nearby. It can even deal with them a much further distance than you would think. But it's really good when you're fighting tough enemies or a group of enemies because it can kind of help thin them out a bit or deal damage to them while you're fighting and just kind of help soften them up for you. The armor that I'm using for this build is the Angel of the Void set. You can find this not too far into the game in the Fen area in a chest in the Umbral realm. And it's really awesome looking. You look kind of like Skeletor. Fits the Death Knight theme, has decent protection. The armor that you use for this build is not like particularly important. You can use whatever you want if you want to go fashion or you want to go whatever. Obviously, you're going to be trying not to get hit as much as possible. But I really like this for the theme of this build. And then for necklace, I'm using the Faceless Carving. This increases your wither damage and wither defense. You really want to crank that wither damage up and lean into it when you're fighting against enemies so you can rip off huge chunks of health at the same time. I also have the Mine Owner's Ring here. This increases max stamina and stamina regeneration. If you look at our stats, you'll notice we don't have a ton of endurance for this build, and that's kind of a weak spot at this point in the game. So getting more stamina so we can swing and block more and dodge more, and getting that stamina regeneration back quickly is really important because we don't have a high endurance stat. And then I'm also using Ring of Knight's Fire, which further boosts fire damage and wither damage. Again, we're focusing kind of on wither damage for this build. You could use something else that boosts physical damage or just damage in general with this build. So when you're taking a look at like what starting class to play this build with, the Putrid Child would be ideal. So if you're playing like, new game and you have this unlocked already, Putrid Child is perfect for their stat distribution. But if you're playing for your first playthrough and you don't have that, you probably want to take either the Pyric Cultist class or the Orient Preacher to have high starting Radiance or high starting Inferno. It's not super important which class you select though, because most classes have like a pretty even stat distribution. And you'll notice we need 13 strength and 13 agility just to meet the weapon requirement of the weapon we're using. So you can probably do this with just about any class. So generally the strategy that I employ with this build is kind of similar to how I play my Paladin build, except obviously we have different buffs and different spells. You're going to want to try and keep Umbral Weapon up all the time. This is something that you want to just buff your damage with constantly so that you hit as hard as possible. And you're just going to want to, like, whenever you run out of this, you're going to want to, like, rebuff with it, basically. And because you have mana regeneration on your shield, you should be back at full mana every time you cast this, so you never really have a reason not to cast this. And as I mentioned early on, you'll have Poison Weapon for this. You might want to use Poison Weapon on specific bosses that can be poisoned, because poison actually ticks kind of hard in this game. And you'll use Umbral Orb as your, your range. Like, if an enemy is too far away, you can't get to them, you'll use that to get them. And again, your mana is going to regenerate, which is great. You might have to replenish it manually using Mana Stone sometimes. That's great for picking off enemies at a distance. One thing I really like about Umbral Orb, too, is it pierces its first target, so it can go, like, in a line through a bunch of enemies. So if you get, like, in a long hallway or something, it works really well. So talking a bit about our stat distribution, you'll notice we have 13 strength, 13 agility. This is to meet the requirements of the weapon that we're using. And also, if you wanted to use a different shield, theoretically you could, because you'll have 13 strength, which is, decent requirement for a lot of shields. And the weapon itself scales with strength and agility as well. So at some point, you could increase these in order to get more damage. We have endurance only at 13, and the reason that it's so low for this build is because we have so many things we need points in. Like, you need vitality. You're playing a melee build first and kind of a ranged build second with this build, so you are going to get hit periodically, and if you have a low health pool, you're going to die real fast. And then we have 22 points in Radiance and Inferno, and this is to meet the requirements for Umbral Guardian, and there will be more spells, Umbral spells, that you'll want that'll have at least this much. So that's why we have 22 and 22 there. But eventually you're going to want to increase these, obviously. It will not only increase the damage with your weapon, since your weapon scales with these, it will also increase the damage of your spells. So you really have like a lot of room to grow with this build, and this build would probably be phenomenal in like a New Game Plus run where, you can take your Radiance and Inferno up to 40 over the course of New Game, and then probably crank your Strength, Agility, and Endurance up in New Game Plus to get even more damage out of your weapon, wear even heavier armor, and have more stamina. And obviously, there are other spells that you can use with this build besides the ones that I've recommended. These are the ones that I just find good early on in the game. There are other spells you can get from remembrances and stuff like that, and I've tried some of them that just didn't work that great for me. And obviously, past this point in the game, this is kind of the middle of the game, there will be more Umbral spells. I suggest that you try these and see if they incorporate into your playstyle. But you're definitely going to want Umbral Orb and Umbral Weapon minimally, just to have a weapon buff and a ranged cheap option. The other two spells you would probably be the ones you'd consider subbing out for something else. So that wraps up the Death Knight build. This build is a ton of fun to play. I've been invaded a couple times using this build, and it absolutely owns in PvP because people are not prepared for the Frostbite, which is really, really effective, getting burst damage, particularly on players reducing their stamina, and they are not prepared for the Wither damage. And you are quite tanky with this build and have a lot of ranged options as well. Just a fun build to play in general. As always, if you have tips for other players, leave them in the comments. If you have questions, leave them there as well. We are going to be doing some more builds. I have a ranged build, I believe, coming next, like a primarily bow build coming, or maybe even a throne build. We'll see how that pans out. And I am working on some other builds as well. If there's something that you guys want to see, let me know in the comments.